when Governor Whitman first came in, there were some very serious fiscal issues facing the state, not the least of which was that every year prior administrations had been balancing the budget with what we call non-recurring revenue items. So essentially they were, looking for pockets of money that might have accumulated in accounts around the budget, selling off various assets, that kind of thing. And one of the basic principles in running a fiscal operation, a fiscally sound operation, is that you like to have enough revenue recurring each year to meet your recurring expenses. And so that was one difficulty that we faced. And by the time Governor Whitman left office, and I'll come back to the pension thing, but by the time Governor Whitman left office, we had stopped using one-shot items to balance the budget. Our credit ratings had been upgraded several times. We had enough recurring revenue. We actually had, when I left Treasury, there was $1 billion unrestricted surplus in the general fund. We had built Southwood State Prison. That was $1 billion expense item. So there were a number of things that had been accomplished, and in fact lowered taxes all along the way. Not the least of which was that the state income tax was reduced by 30%, and thousands of folks had been taken off the rolls. So, I think that there was a good fiscal record. Now, let's come back to the pension issue. During that period, there had been a $4.25 billion unfunded liability in the state pension systems, mainly from when the legislature would pass change pension laws so that additional benefits had been granted. Typically what would happen would be that an employee, for example, that had 25 years of seniority, if the benefit had changed, would have 25 years worth of credit for that benefit that hadn't actually been funded in the pension system because the benefit had just been enacted. So that's how unfunded liabilities accumulate in the pension system. Also, at the time, governments were not, let me back up a second. Private industry that had pension plans for their employees were not permitted under federal law to pay more money into their pension systems than their expected payouts. And basically that's so that companies weren't hiding profits in their pension plans. Well, governmental pension plans were not faced with that same restriction. So we were essentially overfunding pension systems because we had to, put a regular contribution and what they call post-retirement medical. So basically we were funding the medical benefits of after retirees after they retire. So what we wanted to do was to change the plan so that we were only funding what was necessary to fund each year. And at the same time, when we looked at the pension investments, there were pension investments, which generally were stocks and bonds and those types of investment vehicles, some of which had been valued several years old. And at the time, if you recall, the stock market had been, through a long bull run. So there was a lot of excess value in that portfolio that wasn't recognized. So we said, well, rather than use up all of that excess valuation, let's go back to the prior year and value our assets as of the prior year. Well, the value at that point was large enough that we could basically pay down that $4.25 billion liability and get it to a point where instead of $4.25 billion, we sold bonds for $2.7 billion at a much lower rate of interest, and that $4.25 billion had been by law being paid over 60 years at 8.75% interest. So we went out and sold bonds, and the total all-in cost was around I think it was 7.2. So it was at a lower rate of interest for 28 years rather than 60 years. And that $4.25 billion in unfunded liability was turned into $2.7 billion in long-term debt, but again, over 28 years rather than 60 years.
The $4.25 billion was not reflected in the state budget? Is that right?
It was what they call a footnoted liability. So when the state presented its balance sheet, down at the bottom was a note. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's another point that had to be dealt with. Down at the bottom was an asterisk that said, oh, by the way, the state owes $4.25 billion in unfunded liabilities. The GASB, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, at the time had promulgated regulations that said over the course of time, state governments, well, all governments need to start moving those unfunded liabilities up to the long-term debt line. And granted, we did it early, but earlier than what was required under that GASB regulation, but we accomplished what GASB was desirous to do. Now, after Christy Whitman had left office, there was a situation where under the McGreevey administration, bonds were being issued, and the Securities and Exchange Commission got a little nervous about how the state was presenting its debt picture, and came in and took a look and issued a report and said, at the time Christy Whitman left office, the pension funds were 112% funded. So they were overfunded, and that's why the participants in the pension plan were told that you could take a pension holiday, and so that those items could even out.
And by participants, you mean the state and local government?
State and locals, because it's state, counties, municipalities, school boards.
And a holiday that they wouldn't have to put anything in for that year.
But again, we repeatedly said to them, don't get used to having
Right.
this money,
Right.
because ultimately you're going to have to start making payments into the pension system again. And in fact, employees were also given a break, not totally. I mean, I think it went from 5% to 3% for most employees for a couple of years, and then went back to 5%. But what ultimately happened was, the subsequent administrations, for a variety of reasons, decided that they weren't going to start making the regular contributions, and that's largely how the pension system got into trouble.